No one who has not felt it can understand the pain of an exile. Living in a country that is not your own, among people who are not your people. Always a foreigner, an outsider, someone who does not belong. Two families living in Zimbabwe, but the country they call home is Malawi, a country they have not seen for nearly 30 years. A sad, troubled country. Of course, my father and Uncle Fala had their little disagreements, but they were the usual ones among friends. Then there were all those moments of loneliness, of no hope at all, that everyone in exile feels. But they always survived, because they missed home so much. They never doubted they would return one day. That was all my father and Uncle Fala dreamed, the return to their own country. They talked about home all the time, how they grew up, the games they used to play, the schools they went to, the fight for freedom. You young ones have no idea what we had to do to get rid of the British, Uncle Fala used to tell us whenever he could. He was proud of the injury to his leg, which he said he got in a street battle against the government in the 1950s. And then my father, of course, felt he had to show us the marks on his back, which he got from beatings in prison. I was in prison for a week, he would say proudly, not like others who only got injured in a fight. Over the years, his time in prison became a month, 6 weeks, then a year. Don't listen to him, Uncle Fala would answer. He fell out of a tree. That's how he got those marks. And he would break into a great deep laugh. Now, I'll tell you how he really got his injury, my father would say, also laughing. And they would go on like this. It wasn't just that they liked each other. It was much more than that. They called each other brother. It was 12 years or more before I learned that Uncle Fala was, in fact, not my real uncle. He and my father had met in the mining village in Zimbabwe, where I was born and grew up. Their two families lived together in a flat as big as a matchbox. My brothers and sisters and I grew up and went to school with Uncle Fala's children. When we finished school, I and most of my brothers became miners and lived in the mining village. All through their years in Zimbabwe, my father and Uncle Fala were involved in exile politics. It began with the mining village's home burial society. This helped workers from our home country in times of trouble, particularly burials. Years later, my father and Uncle Fala joined the National Redemption Movement. This was an organization of exiles who were against the government back home. When I was a young boy, I sometimes went with my father and Uncle Fala to the beer hall where the movement held its meetings. They were both good organizers and fine speakers. Whenever one of them rose to speak, the hall became silent, and people listened to every word. After they finished speaking, everybody would clap, and I felt so proud of them. When they stopped working as miners at the age of 50, they began working full-time for the movement, which grew quickly thanks to a large exile community. Over the years, the news from home got worse. We heard of arrests, violence, and worse. It was not the government that my father and Uncle Fala had fought for when the British left in the 1960s, and our country finally became independent. In the beginning, my father remembered, we loved them. We loved the government. We thought it was ours. I remember Uncle Fala telling us when we were small about the day of independence. Everything seemed so beautiful that day. The sunshine felt a little gentler, the skies were bluer, the plants were greener, and the air smelled fresher. Just before midnight, the British flag was taken down, and our flag was raised as thousands clapped. We loved every word our leader spoke. We called him the Savior. We thought he would save us. Like so many other people, my father and Uncle Fala spent all the money they had to go to the capital for the independence ceremony, a great day for our country. At that time, my father worked on a farm. Soon afterwards, he lost his job when the farm was sold to one of the new government officers, who preferred to employ workers from his own part of the country. Uncle Fala lost his job because he was the leader of a workers' organization at his factory. The new government did not allow workers' organizations anymore, saying that the workers had no enemies now that independence had been won. So Uncle Fala and my father left the country a couple of years later, as so many others had done before them, to look for jobs in the mines of Zimbabwe. The exiles in Zimbabwe learned to live with the bad news that came from home. They would discuss it and pass it on, but it was something they did not actually experience. Although exile was painful, they could hide behind it and dream, and avoid being responsible for their own lives. I did not think of myself as one of them. Of course, I considered where my parents came from as my homeland too, although I had never been there. But I also felt strong ties to Zimbabwe, the place of my birth. At home we spoke my parents' language. Elsewhere we used one of the local languages. I never really had to think much about my real home until I was an adult. It didn't matter when I was a child. Of course, the other children would sometimes call us by rude names, whatever word was fashionable for foreigners at the time, but it never mattered to me. Not so in later years. It was partly age, I suppose. As you grow older, things seem to hurt a little deeper. The situation in Zimbabwe was also changing. People began to think of themselves less as Africans and more as Zimbabweans. We became foreigners, even those of us who were born in Zimbabwe, when it came to giving out jobs and to finding someone to blame for the nation's problems. That is when I became more involved in the national redemption movement. Slowly, our community turned inward, and as far as possible we kept together, helped one another, and married among ourselves. I married Uncle Fala's eldest daughter, Mwali, which pleased both our parents greatly. "We are now real brothers," the two men told everyone at the wedding ceremony. I began to miss my homeland as much as my father and Uncle Fala did. I wanted to know more about it. So I asked questions. I searched for information in books, newspapers, and magazines. I dreamed of the shining lake with its golden sand beaches, the rivers, hills, and mountains, and the cool green highlands. A land, as my father and Uncle Fala remembered it, of tidy villages, handsome cities, safe streets, and smiling faces. Not this dry, empty land that was only good for exiles. We hoped and dreamed. In the meantime, I grew older. I had 3 children. My father and Uncle Fala began to look like the grandfathers they were. They continued to be involved in the movement, but the situation in our homeland stayed the same. None of us thought it would change soon, although we did not doubt that change would come in the end. Nobody imagined how quickly the 30-year-old regime would fall a few years later. People had been unhappy for years, of course, but it was the church leaders who brought it into the open. One Easter Sunday, the priests read out a letter in churches throughout the country. The letter did not ask for anything unusual, just simple things like respect for the law, freedom for political prisoners, food for the hungry. But the letter hit the country like a bomb. No one had ever demanded these things openly before. Some church leaders were arrested, and terrible warnings were given. But it was too late. The students, young and impatient, joined the fight. "Give us free elections," they demanded. "Let political prisoners go free." The universities and colleges were closed, and the students were sent home. That only made things worse, because the students took the message back to their hometowns. Then the workers joined the battle. They stopped work, demanding better pay. The police tried to break up one protest march, but they only succeeded in shooting hundreds of workers and starting angry protests all over the country. Even foreign governments and banks began to talk about sending no more money to a regime that had lost control. I had never seen my father and Uncle Fala so excited. They had the radio and television on all the time, following the news from home. For some reason, I was not as excited as I had expected. I had become so used to hoping and dreaming that the possibility of return frightened me. Exile had always been my life. It was all I knew. Other things made me uneasy too. Our community of exiles began to break 2 groups, those who wanted to return and those who were not so enthusiastic. The same disagreements were seen in families, and before long, in the movement itself. At our yearly meeting, there were so many arguments that by the end, the movement had broken into 3 separate groups. It was sad to watch. Nothing prepared me for what was waiting for us in our dear homeland. It was certainly beautiful, but that was all. We went first to my father's village. I was disappointed. It was nothing more than a group of rough mud houses. I met some of my uncles and aunts for the first time. They all looked much older than my father, although they were younger than he was. They were nice and friendly, but that was all they could offer us. It was the same at my mother's village, which was a few miles away.